Michael Tennant, how lovely to have you on my show. We almost had a chance to meet in real life. You have just published a book, The Power of Empathy, and it feels like a really useful time to be talking about this. Great to have you on my show. In your words, who is Michael? Michael Tennant.
Yeah, Michael Tennant. I am a son, a father, a loving husband. Uh, I'm the founder and CEO of Curiosity Lab. We make products that make practicing empathy easy and accessible, and our mission is to make practicing empathy mainstream. Uh, that's who I am.
That's lovely. Well, I did want to start off by saying it feels like you've been through the ringer in this journey. Would you feel that that's an appropriate description?
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. I would say we've had some really wonderful moments, life-changing moments throughout, but we've been really present to challenge as well.
At some level, I don't want to say it's sort of and in the sense that these life-changing moments, I feel I mean, I've done maybe 700 of these episodes. And when I get someone on who's done something courageous, big, has done a massive transformation, typically it's because of and thanks to the hardship.
Yeah, I often talk about the most difficult parts of my journey emotionally, which happened in 2019 as my emotional rock bottom, and this moment where I really had permission to look at all of my life differently and permission to let go of any incumbencies that might have been deterring me from trying, taking risks, being willing to fail.
Yeah, you were, I mean, at some levels, maybe living the high life. You're a founder of an agency and doing a lot of things, and all of a sudden you say you had the permission. At some level, was it given to you, or did you take it?
I think the high life, the inertia I was in was taken away. This commitment to the material things that I had. Uh,
The swank
I
flat.
had totally. I had a concurrently. I had a gone from being a high six figure advertising executive and advertising and media executive to starting a business, having it start really strong, but uh, have it start to hit headwinds for the first time as a entrepreneur. Those headwinds were being negotiated and navigated alongside my business and romantic partner. So sadly, when that business also that failed, the relationship also failed, and immediately after that, I lost two of my older brothers. Uh, so in a very fast period of time, I went from just living this somewhat unintentional but very easy to be distracted by great job, great projects, decent amount of money, decent amount of bills to follow it, to okay, everything that I had, I now am in danger of losing.
Yeah, and then not to mention the fact that that just preceded March of 2020, and then
It
a whole nother
ran,
level.
yeah, it ran directly from accepting uncertainty, learning to accept uncertainty, learning to survive through the biggest losses I ever had in losing two of my older brothers uh, in 2019. but then into just almost almost like a I kind of joke sometimes and say that the road trip that I went on for 5 months, there was a little bit of madness in it. But like I said, I had hit my emotional rock bottom. Uh, I had a short stint in between where I was working as a chief marketing officer, so I had this title to prop me up for a while, and then they let me go, and I just I basically needed to learn how to anchor from inside, how to heal from the inside out, how to heal by sharing myself, uh, and being received in a way that I previously had too much ego to attempt, too
Mm.
much to lose per se.
Yeah, and maybe in that there's the stiff upper lip, there's the sense if I show I'm weak, I am weak.
Yeah, I like that you touch on that because right now I feel tingling down my shoulders and actually down my scalp as well. And I'm thinking about the time when I left from, my community in Bed-Stuy, which had its own reasons and own shields that I needed to hold up. It was a quite, embattled neighborhood. I grew up in the remnants of the crack epidemic, not even in the remnants, in the heart of it and in the remnants of it, and was able to get away to boarding school. But I remember showing up in predominantly white. You said stiff upper lip, so that's what targeted it. Because yeah, that somehow got acquired a different type of shield in order to be safe in uh, elite white America. I needed to learn
Mm.
how to protect in a different way, and in some ways I'd say the downside is that stiff upper lip that probably helped me in corporate America as well.
Mm. Well, it sounds like it's help or abetting, maybe, and sometimes detracting. The word you use is resilience. What's your shield? And I kind of
Mm.
interpreted that as a little bit like stiff upper lip.
Ooh, yeah, thank you for bringing up that opportunity to present a nuanced view on resilience. When resilience became an anchor value for me, this is after this is after um, Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down in Atlanta. Yeah, and I can feel the sadness that I felt then and the despair that I felt then, the commonality that I felt. I was living with my parents in Florida in the middle of the pandemic. Um, And I connected that to, just other moments of struggle throughout my life and struggle throughout my parents' life, and the struggle that as a young Black man growing up gratefully in schools that prior to boarding school, where I was taught by predominantly Black and Caribbean teachers who taught me a lot about the struggle from the Atlantic slave trade to how that manifested in the Caribbean world to how that manifested in the Americas, and still all the greatness, all the thought leadership, the artistry, the resilience, and the very myriad of ways that showed up. So what I really wanted to do is to take trauma and turn it into a badge, uh, to turn trauma into a gentle shield,
Mm.
resilience, something that we don't need to be weighed down by, but rather propelled by. There's a question in my conversation game that is, my conversation game actually curious, and that is, what is one trait you're proud to have inherited from your parents? And resilience is one of them.
Hmm. I'm almost inclined to say it's a little generational at some level, because they, and let's say, well, I'm more closer to your father's age than you, um, but I don't consider myself part of the older generation in that respect. But there is a notion that the older generations didn't have a vocabulary, didn't have exposure to, and were ingrained with the idea of resilience. We're ingrained with the idea that life is full of adversity,
Yeah.
and that is why you need to be resilient.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, there's certainly, my parents would have a different relationship with the word resilience than I do.
Mm.
Um, because there's this expectation, I think, and it's not actually, it's not just across color lines, it's not just across generation lines. I'd say myself, I'm about to turn 40 uh December 1st.
You're gonna
So,
have to keep trying to get closer to me. Quite a long way off.
but I do think that, my generation, having been raised, I think there's still a cultural inertia around a stiff upper lip as the norm to be aspired towards, and that type of resilience, this sort of, it's shameful to um not show the spectrum of emotions that show up throughout struggle, that kind of resilience. And that's not what I'm meaning to celebrate.
No, I can understand that, of course. Um, the fact that you lost your two brothers, do you have other siblings? I don't remember reading anything else about other siblings.
Yeah. I have one older brother, and I have a few half siblings.
Right. And the two of them together, when I first read the time you said you lost two brothers in the same year, uh, I was just imagining it must have been a car accident, both of them in it. The fact that I mean, what a absolute shocker before 50 years old to die so close to one another. I mean, one is just terrible, but two,
Yeah. I've had surprisingly this really interesting camaraderie that's shown up among people who understand what it's like to lose a sibling young. It's it's certainly usually so unexpected that it just tends to ripple through a family differently.
mm,
Um, Especially when the parents are still alive, so it almost seems to skip a generation of loss, which no one wants any loss, but in some ways that tends to be somewhat more understandable.
mm.
So uh I was kind of almost like a my brothers could have almost been, in some ways they could have almost been my parents. There was a 13-year difference. So I really had this I think most siblings, especially among brothers, there's this like hero like admiration of an older sibling. But my brother Chris, when I lost him, it destroyed me. He was not only an older brother. What I would come through the reflection that I've done through my work of empathy, and through being supported in men's work and healing, I've come to realize that Chris was one of the few people that showed me consistent gentleness. I didn't have language like that at that point, but one of the reasons why it was so hard to lose him is that
Mm.
we just had a different bond. And then my brother Darren, who they're the middle two, but my three oldest brothers, they were born really close to one another in Jamaica. And then I came 13 years later in America,
With the
uh,
same mum.
with the same mom. And when Darren passed, it was also really devastating because he was an army veteran. He he didn't share to any extent the health challenges that he was working through. So when he went from being hospitalized for a week to being released to passing the same weekend he was released, that came as a really big shock to everyone. But one of the things that stuck out to me was how much he suffered in silence and was unable to share that what he was going through.
Well, I've studied a lot of what happens with veterans that come back from war, and so I'm quite familiar with those issues of sharing pains and so on. You mentioned just now the notion of working with men, and I one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I don't know about it, is that your participation in the leadership group, the men's leadership group, Every Man, and I wanted to tie that in with something else, which is that the question is, as you so rightly point out, there's this spike crisis in mental health. I mean, it's basically across the West, not just in the United States. And there's a corresponding lack of therapists, not just in the United States, but in Canada, France, England, Australia. What what do you think is causing this spike?
Yeah. I smile because in a way, I didn't know if it was almost like a like a layup in terms of well, I think the most obvious and discussed cause is loneliness. Um I guess through the thesis that I've been focusing on and where a lot of the attention I've spent is that uh, a lot of it is being caused by our lack of ability to confront our most difficult emotions, and particular shame among them. The shame that shows up whenever we try to go deeper with ourselves or with one another. You know, men, we essentially have been conditioned to believe that showing of any emotion is meant to bring up shame. So let's simplify it there and just say, using men as a case study, with the privileges that we are able to take advantage of as men in our society. I think there also is this burden that you know that we live within, that says don't show your emotions, and if you do, you should feel shame, and if you do feel shame, that's the worst thing you can feel.
Well, I mean, let's say to quibble, of all the emotions, or at least the big five that you talk about, I'm pretty sure we're allowed to share joy.
Yes, we're allowed.
Yeah, and then even anger is almost masculine in some regards.
Right.
It's toxic in other terms, but it's a more a statement of strength. But
Right.
shame, whoa, sadness, whoa, weak, vulnerability seems to be the maybe the bridge between those emotions and the shame.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, anger is a protective emotion. When you really look at it, oftentimes this emotion that we feel permission, and I'd be remiss not to say that situationally, obviously, like the emotion of anger, at times is weaponized against men of color, which is something I've certainly experienced. Women of color as well. Women, period. Um, yeah, but that anger, I've actually done a lot to speak about us all having permission to let anger into the room in a more constructive way. Uh, Acknowledging that anger oftentimes is here to protect something. If we're being just vulnerable, maybe anger is speaking up in the place of shame or fear, or fear is the okay. If I'm under attack, then anger has all types of permission to be here. We want that here, right? Most people would say, hey, if someone is going to tap into anger to protect us, then that's okay.
Hence the notion that it's masculine at that point.
Yeah, right.
Going back to the loneliness story, the other sensation I have, and
Yeah,
obviously not backed up by any data of any sort, and I wanted to pick it up as something you wrote. I was addicted to experience intense emotions, and I feel somehow that this notion of wanting intense emotions
yeah,
is also a more deep problem within our society. It's almost like if you look at it, we have a
yeah,
generally good life going on. Generally,
yeah,
we have access to medicine that 150 years ago didn't exist, progress and so on. And
yeah,
the United States isn't officially at war. um,
yeah,
and the life expectancy is generally longer, except of course for like two brothers and so on. But
right.
there seems to be a craving to need to have intense emotions to feel like I exist.
Yeah. I'm trying to recall specifically where I used that. Oftentimes, what's most resonant for me at the moment is how that shows up in dating contexts. Particularly for I had a history of pursuing really exciting dating contexts that ultimately would burn out. Um, and
So high passion, is that what you mean? Sort of like a high passion, high glamour.
I would say that would be, as started to recognize, like, hey, this isn't working for me, that would be the way that it might look. I started to realize that I would pursue very, very extroverted personality types, much more extroverted than I am. And I didn't really have a great relationship with myself to realize that there was only but so much of it that I could take at a time, and then I didn't know how to communicate when I needed rest. Um, I think that, as you were speaking through the different permutations of how that might show up, I think our, as a society, our relationship with media, our relationship with consumption in general. I think I spoke earlier about making a high salary, but then having the cost to match, the keeping up with the Joneses, if you will.
Ugh.
So yeah, I do think we're addicted to the chase in some ways more than we recognize. And even now, as I'm much more uh proud and feeling in my integrity with my relationship with pursuit of excitement, I still find it as a challenge, as a new dad, as a homeowner. All of a sudden there are these new routines that very much differ from my lifestyle living in the East Village of New York in my 20s and 30s.
Well, no doubt. And you and I shared a few things before going on, but presumably have many, even though 20 odd years a difference that we may had. So, Michael, I want to swing into empathy a little bit more. Obviously, the topic of your book, The Power of Empathy. It's a great read. It's really personable. And the other thing that's really interesting
Yeah,
about it is it's very actionable.
thank you.
You really break it down in ways that people can materially either, read it in little bite sizes, read it one full swig, but there's always these exercises. It's great. And in the process, you dive into what is empathy. So if I start off by saying, obviously I've written about empathy, I tend to think of empathy as just two types, even though I know that they're up to 5 types. So I usually refer to cognitive and affective, but even in those, or at least not in the cognitive, but in the affective, there's quite a big difference. So talk us through how you and how you came to your definition, or fall on that threefold: cognitive, somatic, and affective.
Yeah. I didn't know that. I actually, now I want to research like 5. Let me dive into
Well,
that.
one of them is like self-empathy, and I can't remember the fifth one right off the bat, but
Okay. Interesting. Well, I think that immediately this vision of a pyramid of understanding of empathy came into my brain, which I've never talked about before. So we're going to co-create together.
excellent.
And at the top is this putting yourself in the other shoes definition. I feel like that takes the cake. Most people come up with some version of that. Empathy is the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I would say deeper, slightly deeper sub definition is to feel either sympathy or compassion for others. This very kind of outward focused um, definition of empathy. And then I love the two buckets of cognitive and affective. And just underneath that, so I might as well just bridge to that. I then, when I dive deeper into the shared lexicon of speaking of empathy, I then talk about cognitive, affective, and somatic. And I usually talk about somatic in the middle. I think somatic is, so for your listeners who may not be that familiar with these definitions, cognitive is an intellectual understanding. And when I explain it, I usually say, as long as you know the 5 core emotions and you can start to test, hey, is that what's showing up? Then you've already kind of leveled up your cognitive understanding of emotions. Those are joy, fear, anger, shame, and sadness. Affective is, or at least the way that I define it. So I'm curious how you define it. But for me, it is being able to attune to what's needed in the moment. And that usually, the empathetic leaders that we see or we experience, that's what we're experiencing. Their ability to really nuance their behavior, their words, their direction, their support for what's needed on an emotional level. So I'll pause there before I talk about somatic.
Right. So two comments. The first is, well, the way I talk about affective emotion, empathy is literally feeling the other person's feelings, and that's what I call affective empathy, and cognitive being the understanding of the other person's thoughts, feelings, and experience, their context. What's interesting, second comment, is if you look at the neuroscience, your definitions, possibly in reverse order, if I may, are much closer to what the brain does, which is emotion, feel it, go to my memory bank, evaluate that emotion, where does it come from? And then I start thinking about what does this all mean? And then at the end, I have an action.
Yeah.
So if I re-put that back in empathy words, affective in your term, or emotion anyway, somatic, memory bank, getting a little bit on more of a grip on that emotion, and then the cognitive rationalization, understanding of what's going on to you.
Yeah, I'm playfully present to the differences in how we approach this language. Yeah, so but I do love how you've contextualized the brain processing of emotion. So for me, cognitive is the intellectual understanding, the building block. So it'd almost be the five core emotions. This is your mortar, your bricks. Somatic is sensing. This is the art, this is the biology. It's actually, we can feel the emotions in our body, and the more that we are present to it, we can actually connect the five core emotions to them actually showing up in our bodies before we process which of them they are. So I spent a lot of time in our model just actually forcing us to break those into two parts more often than we normally do.
Mm.
And then the way I approach effective, and not just me, uh, is how you put it together in real time. It not being a mechanical process. You've broken it down into, these are the emotions. This is how it feels when they're present, to a point where you now have the confidence to act on that knowledge instantaneously, or slowing the pace down so that you have more space to act on that knowledge that's showing up.
Mm. Well, I suppose in reflection, the difference is the anchoring around emotions themselves, whereas I tend to accept much more the idea of understanding the thoughts
Yeah.
that, of course, as one will know, are always preceded by some emotion.
Yeah.
And of course, in the way the brain works, the way the emotions and that somatic element is happening so quickly, it's instinctual. But then we have the brain, we go into the cortex, and we're a little bit more
Yeah.
thoughtful about what's happening
Yeah.
in reverse order. But and then to what extent in your experience is it possible to teach these forms of empathy? Because if I were to say I'm not a feeling kind of guy, or I don't show my emotions, is that something you can teach?
Yeah. So my book and our model believes yes. My life experience and the experience that I've witnessed among other men specifically who are deeply steeped in somatic experiencing as a practice says yes. Um, and then I guess my bias would say that most of us take comfort in going to the intellectual, almost as a protective mechanism. That I this model um, means to kind of present that as a premise and say, hey, let's try and see what happens if we try to attune to the emotions above the thought.
Right. And this is the cognitive piece, the beginning for me, which is actually knowledge of, cognition of the five. Let's start with the five emotions.
Yeah.
And not and certainly not to quibble, but one of the things that's interesting for me as I've been reading is how difficult it is to be accurate about the emotions that we're
Mm.
feeling.
Oh, yeah.
And let's say even the difference between fear and anger,
Yeah.
that can be a little bit complicated. But there's so many other emotions that we are. I think here I'm classifying us as men, dudes,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
so good at splitting
Yeah.
hairs in those other emotions.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. What I'm hearing is even being given the prompt to say visit an emotion that uh, up until this point you're not perhaps not that easy for you to access, is a challenging prompt to give, is a challenging prompt to follow, and to get something out of. Does that sound right?
Well, yeah, and the definitions and the nuances between them,
Yeah.
they're sometimes fleeting, They
Yeah.
might be regrouped. You might be
Mm.
feeling multiple emotions and then
Yeah.
recategorizing them, actually being able to split which one's which and what's
Yeah.
causing what.
Yeah. But how often do we do that, though we experience these emotions, that we actually slow down and try?
Mm. I would certainly agree with you. And
Yeah.
that's why your exercise of mindfulness and leaning into this and breaking it down, the little
Yeah.
exercises you have at the end of each chapter is totally worthwhile. We just for the last, so that was really interesting. But the last piece I wanted to talk about was more about your entrepreneurship and
Sure.
what you've been doing. You obviously had a sort of a pivot from one company or the same company, Curiosity Lab, to this new mission you have. And I would love for you to describe, because you write about purpose, and I'm gonna for this point I'm gonna copy a text that you, or, a paragraph you wrote about purpose, because it's something I write about a lot.
Yeah.
And you wrote, by channeling purpose, you are establishing empathy rituals that direct your emotional awareness outward. You are, in effect, increasing your capacity for self compassion, a key component of channeling purpose, which can have an enormous positive effect on your sense of happiness. And from the rituals you establish, the empathy that is discovered can unlock new possibilities in your relationships, from the personal and romantic ones to professional, family, and community relationships. And most importantly, your relationship with your own dreams and ambitions. Holy tomato. When you read that, or hopefully if you're listening to that, you're thinking, shite. I mean, purpose is big, huge. It's going to do everything. Give us A, what is purpose for you? And two, how purpose can really shift people's lives.
Yeah. I love that excerpt that you pulled. You're gonna have to message me, remind me specifically where that came from, because it really does seem to sum up the entire model, 5 phases of empathy, specifically as applied to the individual. This book certainly leans more to the individual than, say, a industrial organizational context, which a lot of the empathy work does. And the reason I do that is, I mean, my personal purpose is to really surprise ourselves as a society on how we can break down our walls of division. But my approach is that if you feel better, then you have more capacity for those difficult challenges. So my bet is that if I help you maximize your well-being and your happiness with these tools that, by the way, also support you in having challenging discussions from your closest familial relationships out to strangers or adversaries even, right? So how do I help you to unlock happiness and well-being? It's that through my experience, I was able to overcome my biggest challenges by having a regimen of consistency around pursuing my purpose, or even around having dialogue about what is my purpose, and then landing on that. And wow, all the happiness when I landed on a deeply resonant purpose. Now that purpose has changed. It's probably changed, like at least like nuanced from some similar roots, but maybe 6 7 times since 2019 on this healing journey. And every time it feels like, wow, it feels like endorphin boosts, right? All of those things that we talked about in terms of chasing these like artificial spikes uh of excitement springing from my mind and my self-reflection and my ability to articulate it to me, right? So essentially, we give you building blocks that help you to actually not only land on a deeply heartfelt and resonance. We're teaching you how do you feel and label those feelings, and then how do you use that access, that willingness to have that same dialogue that we just kind of, you know, in some ways it would seem like we were splitting hairs, but I think we're practicing empathy live with one another, and through that deeper awareness and the tools of doing that, then you get to really feel what matters to you, and so much so that you can put language to it, cognition, as you say. But then the rest of the model then says, now that I know what it feels like to find deeply resonant values and to put it into a purpose statement that I can call upon easily. I don't have to like labor to grab that statement. Now I can apply that every time I interact, from romantic partners to coworkers to strangers to the challenging choices that show up because they inevitably do, because we're people.
And so, how, Michael, do you intentionally insert in your day? What are your tricks for, I see tricks as in your techniques for making it happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the initial building blocks, but I would say that, you know, the uh, attempt to understand in a very kind of intimate and slow way how emotions are showing up for me in day-to-day interactions, in our conversation, in my interactions with my 1-year-old, with work, with entrepreneurship. I love that I get to bring this work to entrepreneurs because we're facing spikes in emotion all the time, surprises that we need to be resilient for, but
Dealing with
resilient in
shit.
we deal with shit, but deal with shit in a way that is uh, sustainable. And then I think that's a new thing that entrepreneurs and everyone who works is calling for, is and has more permission, is I want this to be sustainable. I want to be a part of pushing that collective life expectancy up. I want that. I want that for me. I want that for the people I love. So I mean, how do I do it? Well, I have a daily practice of mindfulness and slowing down, which helps me to also channel slowing down in emergency cases as well, because I have a muscle around it. And part of that is meditating or spending time in a garden or running or walking. But while I'm doing that, I'm checking in with my body. So I'm having a dual conversation where I can then say what is present for me, uh, beyond what I might have spoken to anyone else. What is present underneath the first order responsibilities.
It's sort of like having a meta version of you. There's you walking and sweating or doing that activity, but then there's you watching you sweat. There's
Mm.
you observing what's happening and taking distance from it, maybe to contextualize
Yeah.
almost what's happening.
Yeah, I love it. And so we just got to that phrase, speaking about that meta relationship with yourself in service of your well-being, in service of your happiness. But if you have that ability to do so in service of those things, now imagine what happens when perhaps you're in a conflict that involves multiple people, and you can support yourself as you're trying to show up in your integrity and in alignment with your purpose, even though all these emotions are coming and ping-ponging off of your past experiences, and right. But then you may also aspire eventually to witness what might be showing up for the other key players in the room. Now your ability to practice with yourself on a daily basis leaves you prepared to have a better shot at that. And I'm not going to say you're always going to win or walk out with a smooth You just facilitated this smooth closure to the situation, uh, but you're most likely going to be surprised and more proud of your abilities to show up in those situations than you may have in the past.
Well, the other I mentioned self-empathy. You write about that. The other term that I frequently talk about is organizational empathy, and try to think about how you as a company show up in these areas, and that's obviously a lot trickier whole thing. There's another sentence I loved in it, and we're going to end with this, which is
Thank
for
you.
you to comment on. Empathy is a not so secret cheat code for uncovering our true desires and our unique paths to happiness. I thought that was about as sexy a line as they get.
Wow. Oh man, I'm gonna take sound bites of you reacting to this book and play them back when I'm having challenging moments, so that I can
Cool.
tap into the feeling that I have. Thank you so much for those complimentary words. Yeah, I mean, I think that statement taps into two things. One is bringing tangible process to using your emotions to unlock what you truly desire. The other is bringing a process of trying to understand the subconscious that shows up, that gets in the way of your true desires.
Like the ego, I would say, at some level, for example.
Like the ego, like our fears, like our biases. Those are the big ones that show up for me right now.
Beautiful. Michael, how can anybody go grab your book and or follow what you work on, maybe get some of your curious tools that you have?
Yeah.
What's the best way to go get that, all that?
Yeah. I'm grateful that we have achieved a suite of tools, as you say, cheat codes, if you will, that help people make practicing empathy really accessible in their lives. Uh, the book can be found, it's called The Power of Empathy. It can be found at booksellers everywhere around the world. Uh, our conversation game, Actually Curious, we love it when people buy it from us, but it's also quite widely distributed. So, Actually Curious, the conversation game that teaches empathy. And yeah, reach out to us. The 5 phases of empathy model, which is outlined in the book, I get to teach it at schools and corporations across the world. I've also just recently released a self-guided course at the 5 phases of empathy.com, where you can have my guidance at your own pace to work through the 5 phases of empathy. And I'm just really
Fabulous.
grateful for this platform to share that.
Fabulous. And you are most welcome, Michael. I'll put all those links into the show notes, and I look forward to shooting or chewing the cud or shooting the shit another time, perhaps in real life. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.